In Australia, we acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land, the cultures and connections of these places that span millennia. We pay our respects to their elders past and present and recognise their ongoing role in caring for this country, its people and its stories. I'm on Gadigal Darawal country, and Michelle, who hopefully is joining us in a second, is on Ngunnawal country. As we engage in this conversation today, we'll be looking at the tensions between global and local realities. Let us reflect on the wisdom that has sustained the custodians of these lands for thousands of years. Place and context matters. So in a moment, we'll be pausing to consider what local knowledge means in a world where global forces often dominate. Let's remember the delicate balance between the universal and the specific. This moment of reflection invites us to listen more deeply to both the voices of the global community and the unique wisdom of the lands in which we stand on. Live the questions. So let us now take a brief moment before we dive into the conversation. We want to share the why we're here today and express our hopes for what we might be able to co-create together. So to begin, we're really trying to seek to imagine the traditional panel discussion and not simply have a one-way exchange, but as really explore this as an evolving dialogue. So we want you to co-create the session today and join us in the conversation. We offer the invitation to live the question. We want to soften the hard edges of life through playful, fluid inquiries. These are big topics, but we want to kind of make them easy to digest and understand and engage with. So let's all get moving, act, explore beyond our personal knowing today. So beyond this, we want to weave together the story to see all of our stories kind of come together and make a new one today. In the next hour, we'll speak, listen deeply, reflect, and pause. I invite you now to take a few deliberate breaths to arrive fully, connect yourself, and tune into the moment. With that, Sebastian, could you please guide us through the flow of the session?
So yes, thank you, Tim. My name is Sebastian, and I have the pleasure to present you with the flow that you should be able to see now of conversing together over the, well, what remains roughly 50 minutes. As you can see, we will present a question which has been elaborated with today's panelists. I hope Michelle is going to be here soon in individual interviews and formulated as a proposition, as a frame by Tim and myself. This question will be spoken to from the panelists, as you can see on the bottom where it says riff, and individually first, and then reflected by you. We're moving up. The audience. The panelists will then co-reflect and ideally formulate. So we have a frame, we have a deframe, and we have a reframe. So formulate a question again together when we're parting. Lastly, however, not less importantly, we invite you, the audience, to share your parting question with us in the end as well. So that can be a reformulation or also a parting thought and or emotion. In the in-between, as Tim already said, we will also just sit in silence and listen to silence. Then again, we invite you to engage. So please show yourself as much as you can. Use the camera if you have one, and again, express your thoughts and emotions also when listening. So you're wholeheartedly invited to use the chat. Share from your heart. So be heard and listen. That also means to please mute yourself so we can all listen best. Be respectful. Try to raise your hand before you wish to speak and try not to interrupt others. Let us be mindful of others, and lastly, of our shared time. So let us try to be as brief and specific as possible. And you've been waiting likely for this, our panelists, and we would like to present. Is Michelle on now, Tim?
Okay. Yes, she is.
She is fantastic. So happy to have you, Michelle. However, I will start in a reverse alphabetical order, starting with Valentine. Valentine is the co-founder of Saltos Campos, an agroecological high school, and of EU Farms, as well as the manager, and I should actually give you an idea who that is by moving the slides. She's also the manager of the Domaine de Courance. It's a family farm estate on the Ile-de-France. And Valentine, you'll kill me for this. You make nothing less than to nourish Paris. So bien merci for being with us today, Valentine. Michel, finally, you're a research scientist in agriculture and food with a focus on net zero transitions at CSIRO in Canberra, Australia. You've been called a polymath, a designer, facilitator, strategist, consultant, and social innovator in designing regenerative transitions. Very happy you're finally joining us today, Michel. And last but not least, John. John is another polymath, works for all of life, not just human life. He practices relational design in the cause of systemic change. Thank you for being with us, John. And now, you've likely been waiting for this one, our question. Playing with the tension of global and local, how local can you go? Playing with the tension of global and local, how local can you go? And now over to you, Valentine. Each panelist has 7 minutes. Thank you very much. Thank you, Valentine.
I will try to share my experience of rediscovering the local through my farming experience close to Paris, as I mentioned before. And that is something quite specific. We're talking about real countryside, but at 1 hour with the car south of Paris. And that makes it a very fragile, I guess, situation, but a very interesting one to maybe reinvent relations between the city and the countryside. Because to change one's mind, of course, it takes time. And you might have a few intuitions, but especially with the topic we're trying to address today, I think to leave the place, the talk to me, and send me messages and make me discover things I had maybe never imagined or could exist. It took the time it took, meaning more than 10 years. I've started this farming experience. So just to give a little bit of objective fact, we're talking about probably the biggest privately owned family domain close to Paris in the région parisienne that has converted to organic agriculture. And saying that is actually saying absolutely nothing, because even if I was trained, because you have to be trained in France to do that job, which is probably a good thing, it seemed, and it for a long time, and still now actually, there's something so abstract. I guess I'm doing an allusion to politics. How can you do things? Well, you might want to do it in certain ways, I don't know, creating jobs, bringing back the biodiversity on the land, etc. But obviously, there are powers in place in France. You must know it, France being the most important country in Europe as a producer. Obviously, there are people who have an agenda in mind and who don't really care about what I might think, even if I've got a big, when I say I, my family has a big piece of land. So becoming local, or how local can I get, is what I would say gives me the stamina, gives me the pleasure, gives me the strength, because it's not what I'm doing, therefore, is not a fantasy or an abstract representation, but it's inspired, I feel, by you talk sometimes about le génie du lieu, genius loci, how the place talks to me. And when I mention the place, obviously, meeting again that place I've known since I'm a kid, is also meeting maybe new people in that place. It's letting others reinvent the place with me, because it's not a kind of master plan in my head that I would then have to propose or impose to others. That's not what I think would be interesting. But all that to say, these days, it's the mixture of people who could live in that landscape, jobs that are being invented in that place. And I have to say, and that makes one unfortunately forget about the smell of the grass and the beauty of the sky, and remember the ones who are completely hidden, but who actually hold the strings of the game. And I'm talking about politicians or lobbies of the agro-food business. I mean, I might sound like a bit of a caricature of an activist when I say that, but one doesn't imagine how that world of farming is a mafia, and I still can't get used to it. So, voila, I want to be more and more local, my nose in the clove on the floor, and having a conversation with the sheep, but I cannot completely believe I am free. I don't know, Sebastian, help me a little bit, because you know the place, you know me. I could tell you, many, many other things, but you might know what the ones who are listening to might be curious or interested with more specifically.
My name is John Thackara. I'm speaking to you from France, but my story today is a response to the challenge of living the question. And the question, as we saw, is how local can you go? So my way to answer that was to go to India just a couple of weeks ago and help to organize an event called Care, Value, Place, which was a discussion to mark the launch of a new design school in Bombay, which set out to be different and to learn the lessons of the previous 100 years of other design schools, in a particular sense of rethinking what it means to do a community project. And by coincidence, I'd been going to India off and on for 39 years. And throughout those 39 years, I've been simultaneously just mesmerized by the vitality and the creativity and the resilience and the sheer amazingness of Indian villages and Indian people in the way that they meet their daily life needs in a million different ways that those of us in the West know far too little about. But at the same time, frustrated that in the context of me as a visitor, basically a tourist, but a curious and respectful tourist, one would go to a place for a couple of minutes, a couple of weeks, and then leave again. And my question to this event, Care, Value, Place, was, is there a different relationship that we global people can have to very specific local situations? And the way we organized that discussion was to invite 8 people from different parts, mainly of India, who are leading very specific local projects which are successful, and ask them to tell us what kinds of input or reflections or participation they would find useful. And there were 2 highlights to this amazing a couple of days. The first one, I don't know if you can see we're having funny, this is a packet of cashew nuts, which was given to me by 2 women farmers from the south of India. It's called the Andhra Pradesh Community Managed Natural Farming, which I think is probably one of the most important stories in the world right now for anybody interested in transitions and regeneration and all those things. And it's almost completely unknown. So to cut an extraordinary story short, over the last 10 to 12 years, getting on for 850,000 small-scale farmers, mainly women, have organized themselves to make the transition from industrialized chemical and additive-based farming to different varieties of natural agroecology. this transition has been enabled by 90% self-organized groups of women in villages, learning groups, 7,000 or 8,000 villages we're talking about. 230,000 self-help groups have formed as these women mainly said, well, what does it mean to get out of this straitjacket of industrial commodity-based agriculture? And so it's just extraordinary to imagine, because I think everybody here probably has some opinion or experience of this word regenerative agriculture or transitional design. And we all have and compose, manifestos and to-do lists and all sorts of things like that. But at the end of the day, here is the biggest example of this happening in the world, more or less without the participation of system designers or experts or outsiders telling them what to do. And so this has been quite a major reality check for me, to put it mildly, because I spent most of my own career saying, well, what can we do to help all these fantastic people do a better job, only to discover that they've done most of it without any of us, frankly, being participants in the process. However, when I talked to the two women who, the two farmers who grow these nuts, I said, I'm frankly just struck dumb almost by your story. What can we do to help you do your job better? Because they're now beginning to teach the process and starting up groups in several other countries. And they said, we don't know. I mean, they said, maybe you could help with the packaging of this package of nuts, which they brought as an exhibit. I said, yeah, I'm sure we could do that. But actually, the kind of people in my world of design and system design do services, structures, strategies, and all these words. And they looked at me kindly and said, yes, I'm sure you do. So I then said, well, maybe we could just discuss how could we learn together or discuss together the most appropriate way for us to help, rather than us make assumptions or you try and find something for us to do when we come and visit you. And so that's the story so far, is we need to design environments for mutual learning so that we can learn from each other how we can help each other, rather than make assumptions or make charts or do PhDs or whatever. We need to have interfaces with them to help us get to know each other better and figure out how we can help each other, because they were very keen for us to help. So that's as far as I got in terms of answering the question. But the notion of these third spaces, or what we'd heard from Valentine, places where the place itself is an experiment or a practice and not just a place for thinking about it, I think is pretty central to that. So we ended up in Bombay saying we need to find ways to go to Andhra Pradesh and other parts of the world where they're doing this transition, set up learning places which don't interfere with their work and don't exploit them, where there's a genuine exchange of value. And that was that. The day after the conference, have I got another minute? Who's doing the timing?
Yes, that is exactly the minute, John. Perfect.
One more minute. I then went the next day to a place called Dharavi. And if anybody's been to India, it's a gigantic and amazing informal settlement, is a polite way to put it. 1 million people in a small amount of city, in which is a group called URBZ, URBZ, that have spent 17 years discussing this exact subject of what is a fair and equitable way to learn from each other. They're kind of architects and urbanists, but they are there to learn from people who have created this extraordinary informal system. So interfaces for learning on an equal basis is my answer to the question. How local can you go? I don't have an answer, but I do hope that we can, yes, figure out new ways to discuss that question going forward.
So I just finished a PhD in transition design, and I did a case study in how do we effectively scale regenerative agriculture. And so so much of that is place-based. It is how do we relocalize agriculture? How do we relocalize our eating habits? How do we relocalize the practices of agriculture so that you have agricultural systems that are very sensitive to place and timing, as farmers always are. But how do we do that at scale? And what are all the different sort of sectoral or policy or societal consumer things that we can all be doing to support that scaling, those things that John alluded to, that those designers that he works with, the types of things that they think about. And I might swing across a a few really big territories in linking some of these dots, because in how local can you go, you might start imagining, all sorts of farmers markets and our wonderful community hubs and things like that. And those are all the types of things that we need to be growing. But at the same time, we also are thinking about the things that we are letting go of, that Tim and Sebastian alluded to in their questions. And so I'm going to actually direct our attention to that for now. So when you think about the foods that you eat every day, do you know how many of them are grown locally where you live? So in your state, let's just think about in your state. So here in Australia, you'll have dairy, very likely. If you have dairy or meat, you'll get both of those. Wheat, very likely in all states. Oats, I don't know. Bananas, nope, those are grown in Queensland, one state basically. How many of you all eat bananas every day? And so when we think about unwinding and relocalizing, does that mean that we are shifting those industries? And what does that mean for those industries and the people that have spent so much time making sure that they can produce intensively for what they feel is feeding the world? And I might also link this to another story from back in the day when I was a graphic designer. When I first finally landed a job after getting laid off what seemed to be a million times in the middle of the dot-com crash in the early 2000s, my job was to build a graphics and packaging team, but also a packaging supply chain for a product development company outside of Seattle. And so we were basically in the process of offshoring a very well-known global brand from its original home in Tennessee in the United States to China. And we were offshoring that production to multiple different factories. And so I found myself going from factory to factory to factory with all these different factory owners and our management team working to find packaging factories that could service our need, because now that we weren't producing our product in the United States, we also couldn't produce our packaging in the United States. The shipping, et cetera, the prices, we just couldn't afford it. And so as a designer that I didn't appreciate at that point in time, there are multiple things that I didn't really appreciate. I was so desperate for a job that I had to sort of turn a blind eye to what we were doing, and it was a good job, and I was so grateful for that. But looking back on that, I'm like, oh, I participated in, the loss of all these jobs in Tennessee, and right, I participated in growing this, consumer culture that then, helped feed so much of the relationship with China. But now, as I look back as well, one of the things that's clear, and it might not be quite as obvious to those of you who are not so close physically to China, but there is quite a delicate economic balance that sits between Australia and United States and China. And China might take out some of its frustration on us in tariffs. They might stop consuming our food here in Australia if they're not happy. Might stop buying our wine, for instance. And so what globalization did was it helped create a economic stability. And so when we talk about localizing now, and we talk about industries, okay, food industries, are we localizing those? Are we going to not sell to Asian markets? Manufacturing, we want to relocalize more manufacturing here in Australia. Are we not going to sell to those markets? Are we going to take the manufacturing away from China? Are we not going to sell to those markets? And what balance of sort of peace, if you will, so that economic stability created a sort of global peace, if you will. And so if we're going to unwind and unstitch some of these things, how might we pay attention to the things that we're unwinding and design for those as well? And so how might we design for carefully rebalancing our political relationships? How might we design for, well, what do we do with these industries? Or how might we help those farmers diversify? but who's going to stop eating bananas? You know, so those are some of the questions that come with the global to local tensions. And for those of you who are interested in the sort of framework side of things, there's a lovely framework that illustrates this in the transitions literature that's called the X curve, written about by Lorbach et al. I might not be pronouncing that right, as well as Hebink et al. Aniak Hebink. And so there's a couple different iterations of it. And then it also works nicely with the 3 Horizons framework, for those of you who like your frameworks.
Some of the case studies and the projects that you mentioned, I being an Indian, I myself was not aware of some of the things that are happening in my country. So I don't know about the global and the local tensions. But yeah, there's a lot. India is a big country. There are different things happening in different parts of the country. And the concept of actually local is, if you travel to the south, you know, it's like an entirely different country. I being someone from the north, so you know, language is also a problem, and we generally communicate in English if somebody doesn't speak the same language from our home state. So so yeah, I mean, it's heartening to know that, you know, the things that are happening at a hyper local level, and the self-organization and the collectives that are coming together to regenerate in areas such as agriculture, and you know, we don't really come to know all that is happening, but it helps to have these conversations with people like John Thackara, who are in the know. So yeah, that's my reflection.
Yeah, thanks for the riffs that we've heard so far. I found them really interesting, and for me, it raises a kind of tension in my head, especially something that you said, Michelle, when you were talking about sort of taking these jobs away from Tennessee and kind of moving them over to China. For me, this creates a kind of tension immediately, because we frame this, or you framed this as being taking the jobs away, but of course you gave them to someone else. And this is not necessarily a bad thing. I have trouble sort of comprehending this tension. I'm not sure what I should do with it, because on the one hand, I understand it. And on the other hand, I guess I don't. For me, we take from one pocket and put it in another. I'm wondering if someone can maybe speak a little bit about, you know, how do we deal with this kind of tension which is created, and which of course also gets talked a lot about in the media. Thank you.
I think it's probably the most important question. So for the last, excuse me, 50 years of the environmental movement, we've had this tendency to talk about the environment in rather abstract terms, and in a very accusatory way, in saying you bad people for killing the planet or killing nature, without answering the anxieties of people who say, what about my jobs? I can't afford to worry about the planet when I can't and be sure to feed my family. And people like myself are completely guilty of having this kind of half-aware notion of what the discussion needs to be about. But I think it's what Valentine said right at the beginning. The power of place is that it enables you to make priorities about what's really important. So I think a lot of us here, we're trying to figure out ways to rekindle a connection with place through lots of different experiences and activities, so that people who otherwise are very diverse points of view can then, you know, unite about one question: what is good for our place? And then whether jobs are here or it's China becomes a second order question, not less important, but something where we need to, the interests of the place come first. Then we need to figure out where people are going to get livelihoods from, and not kind of pretend that's not an equal subject. So I think the place and care for place, for me, just resolves many of these contradictions.
My comments, Thomas from Loporo, UK. Yeah, just listening to what panelists said and then reflecting on that, it seems to be maybe as a systemic designer, our role is to make clear about those tensions between local and global, and then help many stakeholders to understand those tensions, and then help them to wisely navigate or resolve those tensions in their own local context. I mean, John's point about local, they already have their own way of doing that. Then maybe rather than trying to solve further problems, maybe just helping them to understand there's a tension going on and the different types of tension maybe. So that's my just reflection.
Thanks, Thomas. Thank you so much. Lena, would you like to share with what you shared in the chat?
Yeah, right now my camera is sadly not working, but I was just really wanting to say thank you to everyone that spoke, like all the panelists and everything, because I'm getting a lot of adrenaline from these conversations, making me feel really interested. I found it really interesting how through all the different conversations and all the different thoughts that were shared, I thought it was interesting how food production or the farming sector system was such a nice centralized way where this local and global conflict tension comes together so well. And I found that really interesting to see that there's a lot of transformation going in people who are really locally rooted, and where we have this that it's really right on that edge of this global world that we build, and also that starting to bring locality and try to find that balance again. And I thought that was really interesting. Just a thought that I was sharing.
Thank you, Lena. Christoph, please.
Yeah, thank you, Sebastian. I was actually intrigued by the question that Douglas posed in the chat, saying, how can I get to know the place where I am? So I was wondering, Douglas, what you mean by that first, and then also I tried to connect that question with what the panelists were saying. Like, Valentine, you said, I keep on reinventing the place through interaction with others. And then there was John saying, well, it's all about interfaces for learning. And then Michelle said, well, it's no fun speaking when you can't be heard. So all the three panelists actually are saying, in a way, at least that's what I make of it, that our very own personal development is actually a direct result of the way we and how we interact with others. And with others, I mean not just people, but also land, etc. So I'm still intrigued, Douglas, by what you meant by saying, how can I get to know the place where I am? And it's not my, place where I was born or raised or whatever. That's my take.
Thanks, Christoph. I'll try to clarify quickly and then let someone else respond. So I am Australian, but I have been living in Leutkirch im Allgäu in southern Germany for more than 10 years. And I find I work here as a service designer, and I still feel like a foreigner in this place a lot of the time. And so my question is really coming from that place. I'm not indigenous to here. I'm not really indigenous to anywhere, especially not here. And so I recognize from sort of doing a broad range of reading that there is a necessity as a person to be in this place where I am. I feel a strong sort of pull to feel that in some way, and to have that connection with the place. But I don't know how you manufacture that connection if you don't have it already. For example, if you were an Indigenous Australian. And that's really where my question comes from. I feel like I need to manufacture this connection, and I actually don't know how to do it. Does anyone? I'd be curious.
So my name's Danielle. I'm located in North Carolina, United States, Southern United States. And I'm also, this is going to be my 6th year here. So thinking about how do I transition here and come to know the place I'm in. And a part of that effort has been trying to understand the history. I'm curious about the role of time in everything that the panelists have been talking about as far as understanding our local and our global communities and our relationships, our responsibilities to one another, what role you're giving to time, and that we must understand the history, or I'm going to pluralize that, the histories of the place we're in, to try to contextualize the present moment of the place and space and imagine how we might contribute to its future. So I'm a part of, we'll be presenting on this actually on Saturday as a part of this conference, what's called the Power Plus Place Collaborative. How do we come to know our place? And where I'm situated right now, very few histories have been told about this area of the United States, and they've been told from very few positionalities, from very few perspectives. And so part of the first efforts of what we've been doing for that is to capture those untold stories of what it's been like here and of visions and hopes for the future, and to share those stories, engage in dialogue, bring them to youth in our schools, bring them to the festivals and the camps, recorded, archive them for others to be able to access. So just really appreciated that question about how do we come to know our place and to become a part of it. And it is through those relationships that have cultivated over the 6 years here that I've come to understand it in a really different way and establish trust and connection. And so my question before that question was, to what extent relationality can play into the tensions you've been talking about around local and global, and push us beyond this either or. Either I support the people next to me, or I give those resources away. How do we reposition those questions to think about our relationships differently and make those, I don't want to even say the word trade-offs, but how do we shift that narrative to something else? So thank you.
There's so much energy around and resonance around, how do I become local? How do I become indigenous to place? But also, Danielle, your question around, or your offer around how do we appreciate different forms of knowledge. And Nadoka also posted in there, how do we look at intersectionality in this conversation? And I just want to offer a couple practices from the local learning labs that we ran at Taxi together with WWF Australia. One practice was in bringing a group of local entrepreneurs together. One of the first things that we did was have the 2-day weekend that we were hosting begin by being led by an indigenous person who then took us on a tour of country, walk on country, and they then taught people about local foods, bush foods, and things like that. And so starting straight away with appreciating a very different view of what is local and the history of the place, and understanding those histories. So to your question or comment there, Danielle, about different forms of knowledge, and really being deliberate in things that you're facilitating and designing and weaving those many different forms of knowledge that that have come up in the chat that John has mentioned as well, trying to show all those different views. Another practice that was really wonderful related to that same project was a circle that we held. We did start it off with, I'll put your post-it notes up here on this, love of place kind of poster board. And so people could start thinking about what do they love about this place? And, Douglas, for you, like if you start to think about where you are now, maybe, you might not feel comfortable with the idea that you might be indigenizing over time, but maybe you are connecting. And what is your love of place? And so, this activity, people stand in a circle and they start and they talk about what they love about place, but they talk about, if they are going to regenerate place, what would they like to see based on that love of place? And you go around in a circle and everybody talks about how they'd like to regenerate that place based on that love of place, because they love that place. And it has this beautiful spiraling up feeling to it when it's done, and there's notes on how to facilitate that in the WWF archives. around that project. If you want to know all about it, just contact me and I can connect you to that. But there's some really wonderful things that we can, practices that we can do to just keep on working on our connection to place and then our connection to many different types of knowledges.
Becoming aware of what you can bear as in your own, you know, personal equilibrium between what, you know, what proportions between fighting and pleasure. Because if you have to change a system, you're going to have to fight really hard. And if it's only about fighting or advocating, or, you know, it's just too boring. It's just too not. It doesn't bring you much. So, but I mean, just recently, and I will not edge out any kind of solutions. For example, in France, I'm trying to find solutions to the fact the organic market having crashed because of Ukrainian war and importation of wheat. I have to reinvent my whole farm, okay, by intensifying the yields. And on the other hand, you have more and more people not coming from the agriculture background who want to join and do these jobs, which is fantastic. But so you have such contradictory messages. So you have to kind of also follow kind of instinct of where the world might need to go, and you try to go in that direction, because voila, it's not obvious on the short term.
Thank you, Valentine. John.
I was reading before we started, you made a list of some of the introductory texts, the role systemic design may play, and I ended up with a list of about 9 or 10 suggestions. I can choose 2 of those in the context of what we're discussing now. Collective sense making, that's something which is systemic design is good at, it's its practice. And associated with that, which maybe to me is the #1 priority, is collaborative filtering. It's several people have mentioned the closer you get to a place, the more complex and the more things you find out about it. And you can quickly get flooded and overwhelmed by the new things you're discovering. I think that maybe systemic design practices in terms of filtering a flood of information in a manageable way would be a very valuable contribution. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. And again, perfect in timing. I'm just going to share a question that we have now reframed. I hope you can see it. And we would like to thank all of you for being with us, waiting in the beginning, sticking until this point. And we put something in the chat to share your thoughts, your emotions, your maybe parting question. This is what we reframed. It's a proposition again, and we do hope to live this question onward. Tim, please.
Thank you, everyone. Yeah, really a pleasure to have the conversation today. I'd like to thank our amazing panelists for their riffs that we all jumped off today, and the incredible engagement and really nuanced takes that I think everyone has brought to bear to this question from wherever they sit in the world and their unique perspective. So I think there'll be a lot to digest from this conversation, many questions I think we're all going to walk away with. So we look forward to sharing some summaries and recording soon. But thank you very much again to Valentine, John, and Michelle.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for joining.
Rest of RSD 13, right? It's a whole day ahead of great talks. All on the.
Depending on where you are.
Exactly, depending on where you are. We'll stay in a little bit, whoever wants to stick with us.
I have to go, I'm afraid.
Thank you so much, Valentine.
Speak to you soon, I hope.
Absolutely, big embrace.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think we can all unmute now. We're in 12, so
Can I do? We're chatting now, are we? Yeah. So
yeah, go for it. What's on your
I
mind?
don't know quite who wrote. What does anybody here who's a professional know about collaborative filtering? Because to me, that's one of the crucial challenges, because everywhere I go, people are just up to here in data and suggestions and new thoughts. And is there a practice called collaborative filtering? I know in the software world, there's all these gigantic global communities that somehow or another manage to share knowledge and share what works very effectively. Do you consider that system design is part of that?
I don't want to jump in on that.
Reaction, however, Adler, I know that it's very close to your heart, and sorry for pointing you out, but and you come from the software world where collaborative filtering is a thing, so maybe you wanna comment on that, having you still in the call.
Thank you, Sebastian. I wouldn't know. There's a question I have for myself as well. I mean, we discussed about amplifying what resonates and sort of attenuating the noise. I think it's a huge challenge, and I see what's happening is the opposite. It's more and more noise. So I also miss a solution for that. John, would you mind to repeat what you mentioned about earlier, the two suggestions about collaborative and collective?
Well, it's just
too fast.
Well, I went to this event in Bombay 2 weeks ago, and we had 60 people in the room, all of whom are very experienced project leaders of one sort or another. We had 2 days together, and people wrote, dozens of post-its on a board, and they sent emails to each other, and we had WhatsApp groups and so on. And after 2 days, multiply 60 by 50, and you get hundreds of suggestions about things that it would be good to know more about. And then we all went home. So my question is, who in the world has confronted that problem successfully? Because it cannot be a new one. I know it's not a new one. Yeah. And I kind of have the impression that system designers or systemic designers are tremendously well organized mentally people. So I was wondering if you would have some kind of hints or a tool or a practice.
If, as a facilitator, often what you try to do is build in the sense-making processes, where you're trying to build in those, like, okay, what are the themes that y'all are taking? Y'all have been scanning this. Y'all have been scanning this. Now what's actually sitting with you? But sometimes that's like the being very precise and analytical about it isn't actually the thing that helps. It's the what sticks in your heart sort of question. Like, everybody's now slapped that stuff against the wall, but what'd you come away with? And that's usually just like one or two real things. And that's where finding other people facilitating ways to find people who've come away with one thing that's important to them, and stay connected. It's the connections that you forge and keep after these things.
When you said it depends on what happens after you have met.
After.
So in a way,
after,
yeah, because we are doing here the same thing, as John explained, with all the post-its, we invite people to come in for just 1 hour, and we give information, and we try, to connect with them and sort of and engage with them, and then we all depart again. So there is at this point, no deeper connection. And when I look at a chat, it's all about, getting grounded, and not grounded. Yeah, grounded, actually, we're on a drift, we're drifting, and we are seeking to get grounded, whether that's physically or mentally, or I don't know what, but it's, when I talk to people, they're all about, well, we want to have impact on the world, and it has to be as broad as possible. And I always think, well, no, yeah, do I want to have impact? Well, yeah, I want to have deep impact. It doesn't have to be broad. Let's use a network to make it very broad. But let me, I want to get to know Michelle. I want to get to know John. I want to get to know Adler. But really connect, and not just taking a fast lane and then jump off. And that's what's happening today. So it's all about sense making.
I have half an answer to my own question, which because since I've been asking it for like 15 years, and that is the notion of some kind of physical base in the place. Labs, hubs, third places, all these words. But that, and my riff, I said, we go to a place, what Christoph just said, have an experience and then go home or go somewhere else. What kind of place can you have that, so to speak, is sticky and curates or looks after the information? So I used to be a big fan of things like hubs and labs until I discovered that they were normally populated by researchers and sort of people passing through. Whereas in many places, they have things like public libraries or a post office or a farm shop or a community college that has always been there. There's millions of those in the world, literally millions, that we could maybe pay more attention to. So that's a whole subject of adjacent institutions or legacy institutions that are already there. I think that provides part of the answer of being rooted in a place when we go home.
John, there's actually... Oh, sorry, Tim, please.
Sorry. Oh, I was just going to say the filtering question is really interesting to me, because I feel like if the filtering is hard, the intent of maybe what you're trying to achieve as a group isn't clear. So if there isn't kind of a framework or a logic or a shared intent for what you're trying to do with that filtering, whether it's connecting to place, connecting with each other, achieving an outcome in the system or whatever it is, then there's kind of a pragmatist or utilitarian logic to that, which is if that framing is there, then the selection should become very clear. And I think from a systems perspective, like that's where you can work out your points of maximum leverage or intersection or the powerful stories or the things that are going to resonate with people. Like the filtering becomes a choice in terms of how best to achieve that outcome.
How do we purposely use language? And I think COVID gives a great example of place and language, because we did two things. We took people away language and we took people away places. So just think about all the restrictions, people not being able to go to a bar and things as such. I know, in resonance to what you said earlier, John, a woman in Switzerland who actually decided when she went into retirement that she got herself an e-bike with a espresso machine on the back, and she went to that one place that traditionally was always the place where people met. And it also resonates back to what you said, Michelle, about markets. She went to markets, yes, but she went to one specific place. She went to the, what is it, not the fountain, it is the, where you used to get the water, where you used to wash your clothes. And that's where she was, and that's where she sold her coffee, and that's where she spoke to people, and that's where collective sense-making was happening. And in direct response, and maybe a little bit, I'm a little bit still influenced by you, Adler, what you sent me as a resonance yesterday in respect to the various interventions here at RSD 13. There's a lot of things that are theoretical, that might be informed about praxis, but that are being presented without any context. So then usually the show goes like this: you're being thrown at with a lot of theory, and then you're being asked to co-creatively throw in your context, which is very, very hard to do with such a humongous level of abstraction. So it's very hard. And Russ Eckhoff, when he listed the systems approaches, he came up with a list of 32 in the early 70s, and we're up to more than 1,800 by now. So I think this atomization does not add, and what we see a lot of times is yet another approach to the other approach, rather than saying, what is the 80% we have in common, and what context does the 20% relate to, and makes it truly relevant. So it's a question of relevance in the end. It was a long one, sorry.
Something that's on my mind to kind of link to what you're saying, Sebastian, with what you're saying, John, about how do we sort through and find relevance amongst all the atomization, but also John, amongst all this proliferation, how do we work through that? And I was at, I think you were also at that lab session yesterday, John, and I was excited about the idea of creating and weaving and connecting across multiple labs so that there's enduring value, but sharing of value across labs. But how can they maybe instead of reinventing and making a lab a new place, how might we use the places that are already there? Because as you say, there are plenty of them in all of these, same in Australia, all these local places that we're working in. But I'm also wondering about, this proliferation of information, proliferation of tools, proliferation of models that's continuing, as you say, Sebastian, and it's so hard to orient. And I'm one of the concepts that's on my mind is compasses. And I'm wondering if part of what our job as systems designers, we help create maps for build awareness, we help surface systems, but can we also help people develop their own compasses or help build compasses so that you can orient to all this information? And as an example, in my PhD, instead of trying to say, well, what is the methodology of transition design, what I ended up doing is saying, how do you construct your own methodology? So what are the building blocks of a methodology so that wherever you are, whatever influences you, whatever feels right for place, you weave and connect and make your own methodology. What's a compass for building your own methodology? What are the pieces you might need? And so how might we offer more of those to help make sense of all the stuff that's out there?
I think that's a really great question, Michelle.